You don't forget certain people because you loved them loudly. You remember them because they left silently and completely. Think about it. There is a strange moment in life when silence becomes louder than words, when absence starts teaching what presence never could. And in that moment, something inside the avoidant mind shifts. Not because they suddenly become emotional, but because they lose access to something they assumed would always remain within reach. There are connections people don't realize they are depending on until they are no longer being chased. And this is where the deeper truth begins. Some personalities are built around distance, around control, around the belief that if they never fully hold on, they can never fully lose. But life has a way of breaking that illusion, not with chaos, but with clarity. And clarity arrives in the form of someone finally walking away without anger, without begging, without returning. Just gone. And that kind of departure does something no argument, no emotional pressure, no confrontation ever could. It creates an ending that cannot be reopened. In that 20-second silence after realization, something internal begins to echo. Why did they stop coming back? Because until that moment, they were used to emotional persistence. They were used to energy returning. They were used to the door always being half open. But divine design does not allow illusions to last forever. At some point, every soul must face the truth it has been avoiding. And for the avoidant heart, that truth is not that they didn't care. It is that they only recognized care once it was no longer available. This is where remembrance is born. Not from attachment in its usual form, but from absence that refuses to be filled. Because when someone who once tried, adjusted, and stayed finally withdraws completely, it does not feel like loss at first. It feels like relief. But relief does not last long when it is built on emotional suppression. Eventually, what was ignored begins to speak, and it speaks in memories. In moments, in echoes of conversations that suddenly feel heavier in hindsight. There is a divine principle at work here. What is not honored in presence becomes powerful in absence. Avoidants don't forget the person who finally left, because that person did something no one else did. They respected themselves enough to stop knocking on a closed emotional door. And that act disrupts everything. It removes control. It removes predictability. It removes the quiet safety of they will always come back. And when control disappears, awareness awakens. Now the mind replays what the heart never fully admitted. The laughter that was taken for granted. The patience that was misunderstood as endless. The emotional availability that was assumed to be optional. But life has a sacred way of teaching value. It withdraws what is not appreciated until appreciation can no longer change the outcome. And this is where transformation begins, if the lesson is received. Because the real question is not why they cannot forget. The real question is what they were never willing to feel while it was still there. And truthfully, avoidance is not the absence of emotion. It is the postponement of it. But emotions do not expire. They wait. They accumulate. They return in quieter, deeper forms when the noise of distraction fades. So when the person who once stayed finally chooses completeness over confusion, it creates an internal fracture, not of hatred, but of recognition. Recognition that something real was present, but not fully held. And divine truth always carries accountability without punishment. It simply reveals. It reveals that love was not lacking, it was unacknowledged. That connection was not weak, it was unreceived. That presence was not ordinary, it was underestimated. And now it lives in memory, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unfinished. And unfinished things do not leave quietly inside the soul. They echo, until the heart is ready to understand that some people are not meant to be chased later. They are meant to be valued when they are still choosing to stay. And once they are gone completely, what remains is not just remembrance. It is awakening. Avoidant individuals often appear composed, detached, and emotionally self-sufficient on the surface, but beneath that structure lies a very different internal reality. When they suppress emotions instead of processing them, they are not actually removing feelings, they are postponing them. And what is postponed in the emotional world does not disappear. It accumulates quietly in the background of the mind until life creates the right conditions for it to resurface. At the core of this pattern is a learned strategy of self-protection. Many avoidants develop early beliefs that emotional expression leads to discomfort, rejection, or loss of control. So instead of sitting with feelings in real time, they unconsciously train themselves to move past them quickly. This creates the illusion of emotional resilience. They may even believe they are unaffected by situations that would deeply impact others. But in truth, they are simply postponing emotional integration. When a connection becomes intense, meaningful, or vulnerable, the avoidant system often responds by creating distance. This distance is not always physical. Sometimes it is emotional withdrawal, reduced communication, or shifting focus away from the relationship. The purpose of this distance is not to eliminate attachment, but to reduce immediate emotional pressure. However, the feelings that were pushed aside do not dissolve. They remain stored in the nervous system and in memory, waiting for a moment when defenses are no longer active. This is why delayed emotional attachment becomes so powerful. While the avoidant is distanced from the emotional experience, they do not fully process what was happening in real time. The understanding of depth often arrives later, when the person, situation, or emotional availability is no longer present in the same way. At that point, the mind is finally free from the need to defend, and what emerges is reflection rather than resistance. But reflection without closure creates intensity, because now the avoidant is no longer reacting. They are remembering. And memory has a different emotional weight than experience. In experience, there are distractions, ego defenses, and justifications. In memory, there is only clarity. And clarity can feel overwhelming when it reveals what was not fully acknowledged in the moment. The paradox is that suppression does not prevent attachment. It delays its recognition. The emotional bond often becomes clearer after space is created, after silence replaces interaction, and after the other person is no longer actively participating in the emotional cycle. This is where delayed attachment transforms into longing, not necessarily for the person as they are in reality, but for the emotional significance they represented. Avoidance may not immediately identify this shift as attachment. It can first appear as curiosity, intrusive thoughts, or sudden emotional waves that feel unconnected to current circumstances. But underneath these experiences is the mind attempting to process what was previously set aside. The emotional system is essentially trying to complete what was left unfinished. There is also a deeper psychological mechanism at play. When emotions are suppressed during interaction, the brain does not assign full meaning to the experience. Meaning is often formed later through reflection, absence, and comparison. So when the connection ends or distance becomes permanent, the absence becomes the trigger for meaning-making. The mind begins to reconstruct moments, assign value, and reinterpret past interactions with new emotional awareness. What makes this even more profound is that avoidants often feel most strongly about a connection when there is no longer an active space to express it. During the relationship, emotional containment dominates. After the relationship, emotional realization begins. This creates an internal imbalance, where understanding arrives too late to influence outcome, but strongly enough to reshape memory. In this way, suppression does not eliminate emotional depth. It simply delays its arrival until silence makes it unavoidable. When a deeply valued person finally leaves without confusion, without returning, and without leaving emotional threads to pull on, it creates something internally that the paining avoidant mind is not accustomed to handling, an unfinished emotional loop that cannot be closed through their usual coping mechanisms. This is not simply heartbreak in the traditional sense. It is something more structural within the psyche, a cycle that refuses to complete, because the meaning did not arrive in a way that allows avoidance, control, or emotional distance to rewrite it. Avoidant patterns often rely on the idea that emotional experiences can be paused. If something feels too intense, it can be minimized. If it feels too close, it can be distanced. If it feels overwhelming, it can be mentally reclassified as less significant. This internal system depends heavily on having access to the narrative at all times, meaning they can revisit, reinterpret, or emotionally soften an experience whenever discomfort begins to rise. But when a person finally leaves completely, that access is disrupted. The narrative is no longer open-ended. It is finalized by someone else's decision, not their emotional timing. And this is where the loop begins. The mind seeks resolution naturally. It wants closure, structure, and emotional completion. But closure is not always available simply because a relationship ends. Closure requires emotional processing, mutual understanding, or at least an internal acceptance that aligns both memory and meaning. When someone leaves without allowing continued emotional negotiation, the avoidant system is left with fragments instead of resolution. Moments without continuation, conversations without final reinterpretation, emotions without reprocessing. This incompleteness becomes the loop. The avoidant mind, which is used to controlling emotional proximity, suddenly encounters a situation it cannot regulate. There is no opportunity to re-enter the dynamic and soften the ending. There is no gradual distancing that allows emotional adjustment over time. There is only absence. An absence that does not respond becomes psychologically persistent. What makes this loop even more powerful is that it is activated by value recognition. The deeper the emotional significance of the person, the stronger the internal repetition becomes. Not because of attachment alone, but because the mind begins to revisit what was not fully acknowledged in real time. It replays interactions not for enjoyment, but for understanding. It searches for the moment where things shifted, where emotional distance replaced connection, where silence became permanent. But the loop does not resolve, because the mind is trying to solve an emotional equation after the variables have already been removed. Avoidants are often not unaware of emotion. They are delayed in processing it. So when the final rejection or complete withdrawal occurs, the emotional system does not immediately shut down. Instead, it activates retrospective processing. This means the mind begins to reconstruct meaning from a position of loss rather than presence. And meaning built from absence carries a different emotional intensity because it is no longer balanced by real-time interaction. The loop also persists because the ego cannot easily categorize the ending. It is neither a clean victory nor a mutual separation. It is not something they fully controlled, nor something they fully understood in the moment. That lack of internal alignment creates cognitive tension, and the mind tries to relieve tension by revisiting the source repeatedly, as if repetition could produce a different emotional outcome. But it never does. Instead, each repetition strengthens awareness. Small details that were once emotionally filtered now appear more significant. Moments that were dismissed begin to feel meaningful. Emotional cues that were previously ignored become obvious in hindsight. The loop is not just repetition, it is gradual revelation. And yet, because there is no pathway back into the original connection, the mind cannot complete the cycle through action. It can only complete it through acceptance, which is precisely what the avoidant structure was designed to delay. This is why the loop feels unbreakable at first, not because the person is irreplaceable in a superficial sense, but because the emotional system has no exit strategy. It cannot undo what has already been finalized externally. It can only process internally, slowly, repeatedly, until understanding becomes stronger than resistance. And in that space, the unfinished loop becomes not just memory, but a persistent internal echo that refuses to fade until it is fully understood rather than avoided. At the center of many avoidant patterns is a quiet, often unspoken need for control. Not control in an obvious or dominating sense, but control over emotional exposure, timing, and distance. As long as they can manage how close someone gets, how much they feel, and when they engage or withdraw, they maintain a sense of internal safety. This creates an illusion that emotional independence is complete, stable, and self-sustaining. But this illusion is not tested when relationships remain flexible, on and off, or emotionally negotiable. It is only truly challenged when something ends in a way that cannot be reversed, softened, or re-entered on familiar terms. When a deeply meaningful connection finally ends without reopening, without emotional negotiation, and without the other person returning to re-establish balance, something fundamental shifts internally. The avoidant system is no longer in control of the emotional distance. It is no longer deciding when to engage or disengage. The decision has been made externally, and that is what breaks the illusion, not the loss itself, but the loss of control over access. Emotional independence, in the avoidant sense, often functions as a protective framework. It allows them to believe that they do not need consistent emotional closeness to feel stable. It allows them to step back from intensity and regulate their internal world without depending heavily on others. But this framework quietly depends on one assumption: that emotional connections remain accessible even if not actively engaged. In other words, they can step away, but the door is still there if they choose to return. When someone finally rejects them completely, that door is no longer simply closed. It is removed from their control. And that removal creates an experience that cannot be easily categorized as routine: detachment. It is not just space. It is finality. This finality disrupts the internal narrative they often rely on, that emotional distance is a choice they can always reverse. Once that reversibility disappears, the mind begins to register something unfamiliar: loss without retrieval. And this is where the illusion of independence begins to crack. At first, there may not be immediate emotional distress. In fact, there can even be a sense of relief, because the pressure of emotional engagement is gone. But this relief is often temporary, because independence built on avoidance is not the same as independence built on integration. Avoidance removes discomfort in the short term, but integration processes it fully, so it does not return later in distorted forms. When control is lost, the mind begins to search for stability in other ways. It may replay past interactions, reassess emotional moments, or reinterpret the significance of what was once minimized. This is not nostalgia alone. It is an attempt to regain internal order after external closure has disrupted the expected emotional rhythm. The deeper impact comes from the realization that emotional independence was partly constructed through the assumption of availability. The idea that I can reconnect if I want to quietly supports the belief that no connection is ever truly lost, only paused. But when the other person no longer participates in that possibility, the framework collapses. There is no longer an option to return and restore emotional equilibrium on demand. This is where discomfort emerges, not from dependency, but from irreversibility. The avoidant mind is then confronted with a paradox. On one side, it has built identity around self-sufficiency and emotional control. On the other side, it is now experiencing a situation where control does not apply. The connection cannot be managed, adjusted, or rebalanced. It exists only as memory, not as an active dynamic. And memory does not respond to control, it only responds to reflection. What makes this even more profound is that the loss of control does not only affect the present, it rewrites the perception of the past. Moments that once felt optional now appear more significant because they were part of something that can no longer be accessed. Emotional independence begins to feel less like strength and more like detachment from something that had value but was not fully engaged. And so the illusion breaks quietly, not through dramatic emotional collapse, but through realization. The realization that independence is not proven by how easily someone can leave a connection, but by how fully they can remain emotionally stable when that connection is no longer available to return to at all. In that space, what was once believed to be control reveals itself as conditional, and what was once seen as independence begins to transform into something deeper that can no longer rely on emotional escape routes or reversible distance. There is a moment in the emotional journey of avoidant patterns where everything that was previously kept under control begins to surface, not because the feelings suddenly become stronger, but because the structure that contained them is no longer there. The activation of hidden vulnerability does not happen in the presence of closeness. It happens in the absence of what once stabilized emotional distance. When the connection is finally lost, in a complete and irreversible way, the internal system that relied on detachment is forced into an unfamiliar state, exposure without defense. Avoidant individuals often build emotional safety through separation. They learn, consciously or unconsciously, that distance reduces overwhelm. If something becomes too emotionally intense, stepping back restores equilibrium. Over time, this becomes a refined internal mechanism: stay aware, but not too involved; care, but not too exposed; connect, but not too deeply. This creates a carefully managed emotional environment where vulnerability is present, but contained beneath layers of restraint. However, hidden vulnerability does not disappear under restraint. It simply remains unprocessed, unexpressed, and unintegrated. It exists quietly beneath the surface, often unnoticed because the system is efficient at redirecting attention toward logic, distraction, or emotional minimization. But it is still there, shaped by every moment where emotional depth was felt but not fully acknowledged. The final rejection or complete emotional withdrawal disrupts this entire balancing act. It removes the external structure that once made avoidance feel stable. There is no longer a relationship to step back into, no longer a familiar presence that can be emotionally dialed up or down, no longer a subtle safety net of, they might still be there. What remains is silence that does not respond to regulation. And in that silence, vulnerability begins to surface, not as chaos, but as awareness. At first, it may appear subtle, a feeling of unease that does not have a clear source, a sense of emptiness that is difficult to name, moments of reflection that feel heavier than expected. These are not random emotional events. They are signals from parts of the psyche that were previously muted. The absence of the connection becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, what was avoided begins to be seen. What makes this activation so powerful is that it is not triggered by the presence of emotional intensity, but by its removal. While the connection existed, the avoidance system could manage vulnerability by limiting engagement. But once the connection is gone completely, there is nothing left to regulate except the internal response to its absence. An absence does not require interaction. It requires confrontation. This is where hidden vulnerability becomes unavoidable. It begins to manifest in memories that feel emotionally different than before. Moments that once seemed manageable now carry emotional weight. Conversations that were previously dismissed now feel significant. The mind starts to revisit experiences not to escape them, but to understand why they were not fully felt at the time. There is also a deeper emotional recognition that begins to emerge. The realization that distance did not eliminate attachment, it only delayed its acknowledgement. This realization can be disorienting because it contradicts the internal identity built around emotional independence. What was believed to be control begins to feel like avoidance of something real. The vulnerability that surfaces is not just about the loss of another person. It is about the loss of emotional protection that once made avoidance feel sustainable. Without that protection, feelings that were previously compartmentalized begin to integrate themselves into awareness. This integration is not immediate or smooth. It comes in waves, moments of clarity followed by moments of resistance, insight followed by emotional withdrawal. And yet, even in resistance, something irreversible has already begun. The internal system can no longer fully return to its previous state of emotional numbness. Once vulnerability has been seen, even briefly, it cannot be entirely unseen again. The mind may try to reassert distance, but awareness has already expanded. This is why the final rejection often becomes a turning point that feels disproportionate to the event itself. On the surface, it is the end of a connection, but internally, it is the beginning of emotional exposure that was never fully allowed before. The vulnerability was always present. It simply required the removal of external structure to be noticed. And once it is activated, it does not seek immediate expression. It seeks understanding. There is a subtle but important distinction in emotional patterns that often goes unnoticed. Some people do not miss immediately, but when they do, it runs deeper than surface-level longing. Avoidant individuals often fall into this category. Their emotional system does not typically respond to absence in real time, because presence itself is not always fully processed in real time. Instead, emotions are stored, delayed, and only later translated into conscious awareness, when the immediate need for emotional control has passed. During active connection, the avoidant mind is often focused on regulation rather than immersion. When someone is consistently present, expressing care, offering attention, or seeking emotional reciprocity, the avoidant system may unconsciously categorize that energy as something manageable, but not fully internalized. The emotional focus remains on maintaining space, preserving autonomy, and avoiding overwhelm. This creates a paradox where meaningful experiences are occurring, but their emotional depth is not fully registered in the moment they happen. Because of this, missing does not emerge immediately. The mind is still operating within the structure of control, where emotional engagement is moderated and filtered. There is no urgent sense of loss, while the dynamic is still active because the system has not yet stepped outside of it to evaluate its significance. It is only when the connection is no longer accessible, when messages stop, presence disappears, and emotional availability is no longer part of daily experience, that the mind begins to shift from regulation to reflection. And reflection changes everything. What was once filtered begins to surface in its raw form. The absence of the person creates a vacuum, where emotional interpretation starts to unfold. The avoidance system, no longer required to manage interaction, now begins to process meaning. And meaning often arrives after experience, not during it. This delay is why they do not miss easily, but when they do, it feels unexpectedly profound. What makes this type of remembrance deeper is that it is not driven by constant emotional dependency during the relationship. Instead, it is driven by realization after disconnection. The mind begins to recognize the emotional consistency that was once present, the subtle care that was not fully acknowledged, and the stability that was quietly provided without being deeply absorbed in the moment. These realizations often emerge gradually, not all at once, creating waves of understanding that grow stronger over time. There is also a psychological mechanism at play where emotional significance increases with distance. When something is no longer accessible, the brain reevaluates its importance. In the absence of continued interaction, the memory of the person becomes more idealized, not in a fantasy sense, but in a clarity-enhanced sense. The noise of daily interaction is gone, leaving behind only meaning. And meaning, once isolated, becomes more intense. This is why avoidance may seem unaffected initially. The immediate emotional reaction is often muted because their system prioritizes containment over expression. But containment is not absence. It is storage. And what is stored does not lose value. It simply waits for the right conditions to be understood. When those conditions arrive, usually in silence and separation, the emotional awareness begins to surface. They may start remembering specific moments with unexpected clarity. A conversation that once felt ordinary may now feel significant. A gesture that was previously overlooked may now feel meaningful. Even the emotional presence of the other person becomes more apparent in hindsight, as if the absence has sharpened perception. What deepens this experience further is that the missing is not just about the person. It is about the version of self that existed in that connection. The avoidant mind begins to recognize that there were moments of openness, moments of comfort, moments of emotional softness that were not fully acknowledged or sustained. This realization adds another layer to the longing, because it is not only external loss but internal recognition. And yet, this recognition does not always translate into immediate action or expression. Instead, it often remains internal, circulating quietly through thought and memory. The depth of feeling becomes more reflective than reactive, more contemplative than expressive. This is why they do not miss easily in the beginning. But when they do, it is not a surface emotion that comes and goes quickly. It is a delayed understanding that slowly unfolds, revealing that what was once emotionally held far more significance than was consciously admitted at the time. What remains after a complete emotional withdrawal is not emptiness in the way people usually imagine it. It is something more precise, more uncomfortable, and more revealing. It is the space where distraction no longer covers what the heart was postponing. When a person who once stayed, adjusted, and emotionally participated finally steps away completely, it removes not only their presence, but also the emotional structure that allowed avoidance to function smoothly. And in that absence, what was ignored begins to speak in a language that cannot be dismissed as easily as before. Avoidant patterns are often built on the idea that emotional discomfort can be managed by distance, logic, or temporary disengagement. As long as there is still some form of access, messages that can be sent, possibilities of reconnection, or even the subtle belief that the other person might return, the emotional system remains in a flexible state. It does not fully collapse into confrontation, because it still has the option of reversal. But when the final rejection arrives in a complete form, that option disappears. And with it, a deeper process begins. At first, there may be silence. Not emotional silence in the sense of peace, but cognitive silence in the sense of disbelief. that anything further can be done to alter the outcome. The mind, which is accustomed to managing emotional proximity through choice, suddenly encounters a boundary that cannot be crossed through familiar strategies. There is no adjustment left to make, no clarification to seek, no opportunity to reframe the narrative in real time. Everything is finalized externally. This is where the emotional system begins to awaken, not immediately as grief, but as awareness. Awareness that something meaningful has fully exited the sphere of influence. And when influence disappears, understanding begins to rise slowly in its place. What often surfaces in this stage is not just memory, but reinterpretation. The mind begins to revisit past interactions with a different emotional lens. Moments that were once minimized start to carry weight. Effort that was once taken for granted begins to stand out. Emotional availability that was previously overlooked becomes visible in hindsight. It is as if the absence has sharpened perception, allowing the mind to see what was always there, but not fully acknowledged.